Welcome to day duo of intelligence analysis and ontology engineering. Last time we delved into some of the intricacies of intelligence, what it is, successes and failures of intelligence. We saw why it's important to be careful about intelligence, think carefully about it and what it means to have it when you have it. And we also discussed design. So working through foundations, first week of class, I want to outline some important content that will help inform us as we proceed through the class. First, for today, I'm going to talk about this document, this type of document. It is a good document to talk about in the context of intelligence analysis of the National Intelligence Estimate. How many of you have heard of this? Probably not. Well, maybe Ian. So before I get there, let me motivate. So in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, leveraging weapons of mass destruction during the invasion, in particular chemical weapons. You guys aware of this? You're quite young, some of you, so maybe not. But I do, I remember. In 91, a coalition of nations led by the US liberated Kuwait. And sanctions were imposed on Iraq. In particular, the government was required to cease research and development of weapons of mass destruction. That was part of the requirements after Kuwait was liberated. Now, preceding 9/11, there had been concerns over the extent to which Iraq was or was not conducting R&D on weapons of mass destruction, in violation of those sanctions. Following 9/11, the US declared war on Iraq on the pretext that the government was conducting such research and had been involved in the attacks on the US. Justification for this was based on a US national intelligence estimate. So a national intelligence estimate it's considered to be, if not the most authoritative intelligence analysis document that can be produced. It's the sort of thing you need to justify a war. It involves expert intelligence analysis input from all US government intelligence agencies. And is indeed signed by the directors of each agency. They have to sign off on it. And I'll say more about that later, but an NIE was produced on the topic of Iraq's potential R&D regarding weapons of mass destruction prior to the Second War. Now, despite stating intelligence agencies in this document had limited information about the potential counterintelligence in Iraq at the time, tentative conclusions were drawn that Iraq continued its weapons of mass destruction program. As you can see, the document's titled Iraq's Continuing Programs for Weapons of Mass Destruction, Weapons of Mass Destruction. Now, Secretary of State Colin Powell presented the U.S. case for war to the United Nations in the interest of garnering support, the coalition of the willing, if you remember the jargon that went on at the time. My colleagues, he said, every statement I make today is backed up by sources. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons, and Saddam Hussein has no compunction about using them again against his neighbors and against his own people. There's a quote from Powell. Now, the US and coalition forces toppled the Iraq regime led by Saddam Hussein within a week of the war. No weapons of mass destruction were found. In 91, Hussein lied about weapon manufacturing. This is a key point. Back in the day, he lied about he lied about not having R&D on weapons of mass destruction. And we found out about that. But then following the sanctions, he actually stopped producing weapons of mass destruction. No more R&D. So the sanctions that were imposed following the liberation of Kuwait, that he was abiding by them. But he didn't tell the Iraqi people or his cabinet because he didn't want to look weak. And he assumed US intelligence was so good that they would know. And we know this because when he was captured, before he was executed, he said all of this. He said, I was lying. I thought you knew. They didn't. Intelligence analysts in the US believed that because Hussein had lied about weapons of mass destruction before the Gulf War, he was likely lying again. And they were right that he was lying, but wrong about what he was lying about. Now, look, the content of the NIE justifying war supported multiple conclusions. And we'll see some of the examples later, but some of which did suggest that he was engaged in the relevant R&D. Some of which didn't. In fact, pretty strongly so. And the Bush administration at the time took a strong stand on the former conclusion, despite the conflicting intelligence. And but even so, like in putting, like I know you're too young to remember, like putting aside the political and like, nationalist sentiments that was going on at the time, because there was a whole bunch of America has to fight back, like patriot stuff going on. Putting that aside, the job of the intelligence analysts in this case were, as they often are, very challenging. It's a very challenging task they had before them, trying to determine whether the Iraqi government or Saddam Hussein's government the regime was conducting like R&D on weapons of mass destruction. How do you do that? How do you figure that out? It's hard. Worth exploring why. Which takes us to epistemology. What does it mean to know things? What does it mean to know things? What we're doing here is we're gonna try to add some structure to the intelligence analyst's task. Some structure that's born out of philosophical conversations or discussions or literature. Not too much philosophy, just enough to get us a handle on the chaos of epistemology, because the intelligence analyst is dealing, I mean, if you think about it from the abstract, it's an epistemological nightmare. A little structure is better than nothing. So, but look, knowledge itself is spoken of in many ways. What does it mean to know something? What is knowledge? How do you have it? When do you have it? One might be said to know that something is true. One might be said to know how to do something. There's at least this division between knowing how and knowing that. I know how to ride a bike. I know that. I know how to ride a bike. Propositional versus know-how. In addition, knowledge seems to involve at least belief, at least aiming at truth, and then justification. So if I know something, then I believe it, presumably. It's plausible. If I know something, I know something, or really know it, shouldn't it be true? It's got to be true. How else would I know it? If you know something, you should have justification for believing it's true. So knowing, belief, or knowing involves at least belief, truth, justification. Now, as you can see here, that's not all it involves. I'll talk about what else it might involve in a moment, but what do you think? Does that make sense? That seems intuitive, right? Knowing involves you have to believing, you're aiming, at least aiming at truth, and you should be justified in what you believe.
I took the epistemology course.
I said not, I said not all. I said not solely. We'll see why in a minute, but at least justification. I want to emphasize this point because, in particular, the belief in the justification point, because this is very much related to what intelligence analysts are trying to do. They're trying to obtain justified beliefs, at least, in the interest of providing conclusions about, uncertainty, or in the context of uncertainty, so that they can justify important decisions like going to war. Now, I said here, it's not entirely justification, truth, and belief. This is important. Observe, witness this case. Suppose Sam sees on the time on a grandfather clock in the hall in the morning, and it reads 8:20. On this basis, Sam believes it's 8:20 a.m. Suppose that it is, in fact, 8:20 a.m. Now, Sam usually comes downstairs in the morning about this time, and this clock has been very reliable for many years. He has no reason to think it's faulty. Because of that, he's thus justified in believing the clock is correct. Well, lots of good reasons, and no counter reasons. Now, suppose, however, the clock stopped 24 hours earlier, so that Sam is now forming his justified true belief by looking at a stopped clock. It seems intuitively that he doesn't know it's 8:20, even though he's justified, even though he believes it, and it is in fact true. He still doesn't seem to know. It's a matter of luck. He's missing the luck, right? As a matter of luck, he's just wrong. Something's missing from the picture. This is just to say that when evaluating whether someone has knowledge, it's not enough to show they have just justified true beliefs even. One must be able to rule out things like matters of luck. Now, this is just to point to really how challenging, even from an epistemological standpoint, it is to formalize or think about knowledge inside or outside the classroom. We're already in a bad way. Matters of luck. This is even worse when we're thinking about applications to intelligence analysis. Knowledge, indeed, knowledge in such a robust sense for the analyst might not be too, or might just be too far afield. Like they might not even be trying to aim at such a thing. They may just be trying to reach for justified beliefs. It might be all they can get. Even so, these components that we're talking about, the justification, the belief, and the aiming at truth are certainly relevant. Now, matters of luck, I don't know. I don't know how we're going to deal with that. Maybe that is just a philosophical puzzle we can put aside. At the end of the day, though, justification, belief, aiming at truth seem to be core principles. Does that make sense? So because of that, it's good to think about how beliefs might be undermined or defeated, or how what you think you know or what you think you believe can be undermined in various ways. And again, we're adding structure to epistemology in the context of intelligence analysis. So these terms will be helpful for us later. You know what a defeater is? It's exactly what it sounds like. A defeater for a belief or knowledge is evidence that the belief or knowledge is false. A rebutting defeater for a proposition is evidence that not P is true. If P is the proposition, it's evidence not P is true. For example, the belief that it's not snowing in Buffalo is rebutted by walking outside, because that's a joke. Because it snows so much in Buffalo. Just walking outside will give you a counterexample, a rebutting defeater. But a better example, the belief that John is not talking is rebutted by listening to me right now. On the other hand, there are undercutting defeaters. An undercutting defeater for P is evidence against P, but not evidence for not P. So in the first case, the rebutting is evidence for not P. There's a subtle distinction, right? So the belief that it's not snowing would be undercut by recognition that one has ingested psychedelics and perhaps is not perceiving things as they normally would. It is not to say that it is snowing. It's just to say that maybe you should discount your assessment. Unfortunately, it is not often the case that we get straight rebutting defeaters. We more often than not get undercutting defeaters. There's a balancing act of like, is this true? Well, there's some reasons to think not, but there's some reasons to think so. It's not often the case that you get like firm evidence that something is not true. I wish. My life would be a lot easier. It's actually a lot easier to get that in logic, but that's a seminar that's taught in a few hours. So we'll talk about that then. For now, remember these terms. We'll be using them as we proceed. In addition, and this gets over to the point, or another important aspect of the challenges associated with the intelligence analyst tasking. It seems plausible that your environment might affect the way or whether you know or even are justified in your belief about something. Now, this is not exactly a matter of luck. It's more, it can be associated with it, but it's more or less a matter of like stakes. And this is very important here because when you are engaged in analysis of the sort we're interested in, the stakes are often quite high. So pragmatic encroachment is the thesis in epistemology that maintains differences in pragmatic environments may constitute differences in knowledge. You can also replace that with justified belief. Here's an illustration. Hannah and her wife, Sarah, driving home on a Friday afternoon. They plan to stop at the bank on the way home to deposit their paychecks. It's not important that they do so. They have no impending bills, but as they drive past the bank, they notice the lines inside are very long, as they often are on Fridays. Realizing that it wasn't very important that their paychecks are deposited right away, Hannah says, I know the bank will be open tomorrow since I was there just 2 weeks ago on Saturday, so we can deposit our checks tomorrow morning. Justification. Again, you could replace no with justified beliefs. It seems like Hannah plausibly, at least without stretching the concept too much, knows that the bank will be open. Adjust the case slightly. Hannah and her wife Sarah driving home on Friday. They plan to stop at the bank, etc. Since they have an impending bill coming due and very little in their account, it's very important that they deposit their checks by Saturday. Hannah notes that she was at the bank 2 weeks before on Saturday and it was open, but as Sarah points out, banks do change their hours. Hannah says, I guess you're right. I don't know that the bank will be open tomorrow. Same case, different stakes. And if that one's not compelling, I have a child. I can't send her to school with peanut butter. Sometimes I know there's no peanut butter in her lunchbox. Right? I make a peanut butter, I make a sandwich with like sun butter or something, and I send it with her. Now, I then learn later that one of the kids in her class is in fact allergic to peanut butter or peanuts. I start second guessing myself. Is it in fact the case that I didn't send her with peanut butter? Did I use sun butter and not peanut butter? Did I know? Before I knew, it was fine. The stakes were different. Later, it's not clear. It's reasonable for me to second guess myself. But the only thing that changed was that maybe I learned that somebody in her class was deathly ill or deathly averse or allergic to peanut butter. Whereas prior, it was only the possibility of that. Does that make sense? Stakes can adjust your justification or your knowledge, it seems like. Again, this is very important in this context. We're thinking about intelligence analysts and the stakes associated with their decisions and their knowledge. If you're going to justify a war, you need some high credence.
Yeah. I think of it as pragmatic in the linguistic sense versus, okay, so it's more.
Yeah. I mean, it's in the literature they call it pragmatic encroachment because most of the discussion around it has to do with pragmatics and language and the impact, but it's broader than that. And it has been broader than that in the literature. It's sort of like a bad label. I would call it like practical encroachment or contextual encroachment.
Yeah, waterboarding is a good example.
Waterboarding.
Waterboarding doesn't work because the person just doesn't want to be waterboarded, so they're just going to tell you anything. But one thing I'll say about the intelligence community is that we have something called SCI, which is secret compartmental information. And so the analyst typically just treats everything like it's the most important thing ever. And they're really detached from mission, so they actually don't know if anything's going to be used or if everything's going to be used. So think of it that way, that
Pretty
like,
high stakes. Go back. So Jay and Tim, you both said waterboarding. Could you expand on that? So this is a scenario in which we're linking it up to pragmatic encroachment. So differences in environment may constitute difference in knowledge. And so for the person being waterboarded, I guess, let's say the waterboarding is built into like accuracy. Like there will be a continual waterboarding unless we can verify what you're saying is true. And now the person being the victim here or the person being like waterboarded might have higher stakes for themselves to know, like to know that what they're saying is accurate, else they're going to be continuously tortured in this way. And so they may question things that they thought they knew. And so prior to this, they may have been like, yeah, I know so-and-so was this location at this time. But now they may be more inclined to say, only say things that they're really, really certain about. Else they might, get the whip, right? Is
Tim,
that the idea?
well, I'll just say something first. I don't even think you need the waterboarding for this. So this is just an interrogation tactic that I know interrogators, like we're in Iraq, a lot of times they'll only ask questions they already know the answers of.
Yeah.
When you start asking questions that you don't know the answers of, then you bring in a lot of different variables because people can lie, people can embellish, people can just say things that were true a month ago or whatever. Tim?
Gotcha.
Yeah, I got nothing to add on there.
Okay, that makes sense.
To kind of expand on what I was trying to say is, so stakes is a really vague word. Well, maybe not vague, but it's not very particular. So say I'm on a time crunch. I can see that I would lower, and this has happened. I am late for a show in New York and I don't know where the theater is. My justification bar is lower because I need to get there now. So when somebody random told me, oh yeah, you just go down this way, I just listened to them. They didn't have a phone, they didn't have a map, they didn't have any way of, they could have been pointing me to whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But my bar for justifying the knowledge disappeared because of the stakes.
Mm-hmm.
And they sent me in the wrong direction. As we were walking that way, I was on the map trying to figure out where the fuck it was,
Mhm.
and was like, no, wait, we're going the wrong way. But the stakes for me as the investigator actually lowered I wasn't more doubtful. I wasn't more likely to be like, wait, is this right? I was more likely, and I did actually, be like, whatever, I need to be there now,
Mm-hmm.
which actually made me leave. So that's where I was trying to wonder, and we kind of talked about the variations of how little things that you do
Mm-hmm.
to adjust the stakes can have these wild responses. And that's one of the ones that came up. So I was just wondering if for the intelligence community, that was something that, like, if there was something you could reference to of whether or not they become more cautious or less cautious.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Go ahead.
have you ever heard of SEER school? So we send like all pilots that are going to go into an active war zone have to go to SEER school. I know people have been to SEER school. So it's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. We've had this school since the 60s, really since Vietnam. Okay. And what service members are taught is you can only give your name, rank, serial number. That's it. Okay. And what they do is there's like, I don't know, hundreds of bones in the body, and there's a certain number of bones they're allowed to break on you. Okay. I know a guy who the last day is so basically what they do is they take you in a helicopter or they blindfold you in a Humvee. They drop you in the middle of like the forest or something. I know a guy who did it in Maine in February in 1981, and all he had on were wool socks. And then you have to try to survive and escape from the enemy. And then eventually they're going to catch you. And then they're going to torture you. And they're going to teach you how to be tortured and not give up information. So you got to think, if we've been doing this as the United States from the 60s, Mossad's doing it, the KGB's doing it, like other countries are doing this type of training. So when you are now an investigator and you come across somebody who might be a high-ranking officer, you have to think that they're probably well conditioned to not tell you what you want to know. So if you take your example of somebody giving you bad directions because they didn't have GPS on their iPhone, that's not really what you're going to deal with in the IC or in the Department of Defense. You're going to be dealing with actors that, just like in the reading we had, where like there's disinformation that other countries are doing. There's also, as much as we can interrogate, there's anti-interrogation tactics that they learn how to cope with. And part of that is like they learn how to be waterboarded. They learn how to be punched in the face or have their fingers broken, stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's pretty scary stuff, but I mean, it's true.
Absolutely. So I see two lines here, and one Jay is pointing to, which is a very good point. Like this adds to the complexity of of analysts, right? Like the sort of information sourcing, whether you can vet it, trust it, then there's certain tactics you can use to get certain information, but you have to keep in mind, like this is not just an uncertainty situation, but like a sort of like their countermeasures already in place. They're going to in part to prevent you from gaining access to information that people don't want you to have. That's one level. And on the other, I think Jay's right. Like on that level, the sort of like case that Matthew's pointing to might not be operative. But then there's this other level, right? Which is, what's done with the information, what you can anticipate being done with the information. I think it's relevant here to the Iraq case, because it wasn't just like, I mean, there was a lot of, there were a lot of lowering the bars to justification, we'll say, when people were reading the document. If you I listened to some podcasts about Intel analysts, like directors who had signed off on this document. In retrospect, they're like, we shouldn't have signed that. And why did they? Well, there are many reasons. The context, like the nationalism, the pride, the desire to like have some kind of like response in the world. And plus like the pressures from the environment. Other agencies are pressuring this way and that way, and other people from the ground up, they're saying we need to do stuff, people from the top down as well. And so all of that, this context makes the stakes seem higher, like significantly higher. And just as Matthew's saying, may for some people have lowered the barrier to justification. to make it easier to sign such a thing or move on these sorts of decisions that, as we'll see when we look at the content of the NIE, there it was kind of conflicting. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I'm
is that-
sorry, John. So yeah, John, so what you're saying is like an agenda could um distort the intelligence or have it applied in a or misused.
Yeah.
So the intelligence agent's going through and saying that, you know, we have intelligence that there's a factory with machinery that could be used to make chemical weapons, but in reality, it's making baby formula, but that same equipment could be used to make chemical weapons. But
Mhm.
there's an agenda. We need to take out the current government in this country.
Mhm.
So now they're just taking and they're looking for anything in intelligence that could fit that agenda.
So I think that's sort of an extreme characterization of, like, I wouldn't put it that way, but I do think it highlights the point. And as we'll see when we look in the NIE document, it's almost fortuitous that you described it that way. You'll see there's a summary judgment about what the conclusion of the agencies was. And then there are like dissenting opinions. And the dissenting opinions are of the sort you just described. They're like, I think what's going on is they're manufacturing this other thing, and I don't think there's enough evidence to support that this thing they're manufacturing is used to like create uranium or whatever, yellow cake or whatever it was, right? You'll see. So, but yeah, I think as Matthew's pointing out, and I think you're pointing to here too, like in some cases, the stakes, the agenda, the narrative, the movement, the push, that can lower barriers to justification. Like, and so you maybe think that you know something that you didn't before. And that's important, or at least you have a justified belief in something that you might not have outside of this context. It's important because remember, like at least in the case we're describing, this is justification for war. That's a big deal. Ian.
I was gonna say, kind of based on the stakes. So the higher stakes kind of just change the criteria for how you evaluate whether you even have knowledge, right? Because those doubts we're saying are a type of defeater, essentially.
Yeah,
like
right.
personal doubts.
Right.
That doesn't seem the same thing as being evidence that the knowledge is false in some way.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
You're in that realm of like
Yeah.
undercutting, right? Which is much of the realm of like epistemology when it's really applied. It's certainly in this case, like I was saying, you don't often get evidence that not. You more or less get evidence that maybe not. Yeah, Matthew?
The only other thing that I want to point out
Mhm.
is that though I'm actually still walking this really fine line of who the hell we're trying to define intelligence for.
Mm-hmm.
Because though I asked about the intelligence community, we're not trying to define intelligence for the intelligence community
Yeah.
as well. If
Yeah.
you are,
Kinda.
that domain specific
Mhm.
nature is actually not that outer bubble of intelligence that you were talking
Oh, I
about.
know.
Which is why I pointed out an example from my own life
Yeah.
of where JTB kind of fell apart because all I needed to do was adjust stakes, and then my J was just kind of irrelevant.
This is good. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And this is a good sort of, again, it's almost like you're a plant sometimes. This is a good opportunity for me to say the following. So remember I asked you last time, and I'll say this again, just trust the process. Sometimes I'll have you talk through conversations or topics or have discussions about things that, you know, it might be like, hey, why are we talking about this instead of what we were talking about last time? Don't worry, just trust the process. I have other machinations.
That's gonna be
But thank you
very
for,
hard
oh, I know, but it's part of the plan. We are going to hit intelligence in the broad sense and the narrow sense as well. And this is going to help us get there. But I'm also wanting to make you feel a little uncomfortable.
Don't worry, I just typed in my notes. Trust the process.
Trust the process.
John, Matilda had a question for
Oh,
me.
yeah.
She said, what about all the government officials that don't have that training, but do have valuable information?
Yeah.
So that's one reason why you really need to have really good civil servants that are lifers in the intelligence community, and they have that mission goal. And I mean, I'll tell you, and I'm sure other people on this call, that like there's a lot of good Boy Scout civil servants out there that regardless of the situation, they're going to want to do things by the book. And that's kind of what the American people, I think, wants, right? We want people doing things by the book. And I think the long paper that we read talked about what makes a good analyst is not to have confirmation bias, right? Is to give the analysis based upon factual information, regardless of that factual information is going to be politically advantageous to somebody or not. And, so I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
I was thinking one of those, the flipping of the high stakes, low stakes situation was believing tip lines for kidnapped kids. The stakes are high. You're going to believe any information you run down. Like, what if a foreign agent or foreign government were to take control of one of your government officials? Like, you would want to track them down. You would believe any information you could get to them. No?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you would want to be able to assess it, right? Like, the question isn't whether you would believe information that got you to them. It's whether you have the evidence or justification to believe it, right? Or whatever is coming in, because you're going to get a lot of information. Not all of it's going to, right? But I can imagine, and it's not hard to imagine that you'll run down every line, you'll run down rabbit holes. Maybe not because you believe it's the way forward, but because you're trying to gather more evidence to see if it is a justified rabbit hole to go through.
I mean, they made a great movie about this with when we killed Osama bin Laden, right?
Oh,
and they did not want to listen to the analyst because they thought it was too risky.
Oh.
And so a lot of it too is you got to realize that, like, there's a big difference between us lobbing missiles into a country and us running sorties over that country. So once we have US personnel that are going to be like engaged in mission inside of a country, it changes the stakes completely, because then you have to think, okay, is it going to take SEAL Team 6? Is it going to take, a special ops team to go in and extricate? And then there's likelihood for more US casualty. And so a lot of, they're not just making these decisions lightly, I mean, I think, when we decided to go in after Osama bin Laden, everyone's seen the pictures from the war room when, Obama was in there, and you could see the look of worry on all those people's faces. Like, they were really worried about, if this is going to go well, if we're going to lose anybody, because then we have to justify that to the world, and we've justified it to the American people,
You get like that, right? Like, you get what Jay's saying, right? The stakes are not, there are many ways to characterize the stakes. These are important decisions that are being made, and they change based on like how the operations are going to go, why the operations are being conducted in the first place, what the evidence is. So hopefully you're getting a flavor, like at least a feel for how challenging it is to work in this sort of environment. Like, a lot rides on it. There's a reason when you're dealing with like SCI documents, right? Like, you just treat it all high priority. Yeah. So with that,
wanted to ask, with was it JTB elements for knowledge? I noticed you said aiming for the truth more than truth itself, and I was wondering if that means there are cases where belief and justification would fill in the gap when you can't have the truth for knowledge.
like a belief in justification because you don't have belief in truth?
I guess.
Because I will say yes. I mean, it won't count. It won't get you to knowledge. But I mean, I think most often we operate that way anyway, right? Like, if you press me on things I think I believe I have justification for them. Or at least I hope I do. Like, ask me why I think I'm bald. It's because I shave. Actually, I didn't. That was a lie. You guys are too trusting. Spell out naturally. But you see, like, justification in your beliefs, in your justified beliefs. That's often how we roll, even in the absence of truth. As we see when we get through, next time when I actually do discuss and give you my preferred characterization of intelligence, you'll see that I actually don't include truth. In fact, I have arguments against it. We'll see. That's food for thought. But before then, arguments. Evidence and valid arguments. So among the goals of intelligence analysis is to provide justification for conclusions drawn from investigations. Justification, as we've discussed, is often tied up in argumentation. That makes sense, right? Where does justification come from? What do you do with it? How does it use? Where is it, right? It's in arguments. We argue all the time. Now, you may not think about justification that you have or justification that you offer in the context of arguments, but it is. Arguments, what are those? They're kind of tools for persuasion. Fundamentally, That's what arguments do. They persuade, they're aiming at persuading, whether it's you or somebody else. And justification is a core part of arguments. Broadly speaking, we can distinguish three major types of argument. And as some of you will be more familiar with this than others, so I want to walk through so we can get everybody on the same page. They're deductive arguments. These are arguments where that aim to draw a conclusion from premises just based on logic, logical consequence. If this, then that. Here's an example. A valid argument is a deductive argument just in case, or such that if the premises are true, then so is the conclusion. Here's an example. If John is a human being, then John is a mammal. John is a human being. What follows? John is a mammal. There's no way for premise 1 and 2 to be true and the conclusion to be false. Go ahead and try to come up with a counterexample. You will fail. Now, I highlight this because I just want to note these are rare. Now, in philosophy rooms, we often talk about arguments in this structure. We often try to put our arguments in this format. These are rare, very rare. You don't see them in the wild very often. People don't argue this way. Evidence doesn't come in this way. Justification isn't gained this way. It's more often gained or acquired in these other two argument forms, which I call risky arguments. Risky because the conclusions that you draw are not guaranteed by the premises. The first is inductive arguments. We do this all the time. So to analysts, like most of us, we more frequently encounter these sorts of arguments, and inductive arguments involve conclusions that may be likely given the premises. You can think of them, the premises, as being outstripped by the conclusions. Here's some examples. There are 20 oranges in this bag. 12 oranges have been inspected and are delicious. Hence, most of the other 8 oranges will be delicious. Another, there are 20 oranges in this bag. This randomly chosen orange is delicious. Hence, most of the remaining 19 will be delicious. One of these arguments should seem better than the other, but they're both inductive arguments. See, you see how the conclusion outstrips the premises. You're taking a bit of a leap of faith. Now, we can get a little more precise. I just bolded most here. And I want to talk about how you might be more precise, just in case anybody thinks, oh, if only we had more precision, this would be easier. We could get something like a real conclusion that's guaranteed. Nope. What does most mean? And most of the oranges in the bag will be delicious. 90%, 80%, 50%, greater than 50%? Greater than 50% is a cheap way to do this. Let's just plug it in. The conclusion now for the first argument. More than 6 of the remaining oranges in the bag will be delicious. Conclusion in the second. More than 16 of the remaining oranges in the bag will be delicious. I just dropped in the proportions. I think it was in like 90%. Does that help? Still a risky argument, right? I didn't change anything. Adding precision didn't guarantee the conclusion. It just made you maybe feel like it did because you saw math. Don't be deluded. Neither is guaranteed to follow. In addition, stakes matter. What does most mean in the context of most people in the US will be infected by SARS-CoV-2? Not oranges. 20 people in this community. 12 have tested positive for COVID. Hence, most of the other 8 will test positive for COVID. 20 people in this community. Randomly chosen person is test positive for COVID. Hence, most of the remaining 19 will test positive for COVID. All inductive. Some might seem better arguments than others. The stakes impact the evaluation of the conclusion, right? You see that, right? Oranges are one thing. Infectious disease is another. Now, it may not, depending on what time of a couple of years ago it was, this second argument might still seem very good to you. I know there are people all over Twitter who would have been like, yep, this follows stakes. Does that make sense? Okay. Nevertheless, neither conclusion is guaranteed to follow. All right, revisiting the NIE. So throughout this document, justifying war with Iraq intelligence analysts were only able to offer risky inductive arguments. and some abductive arguments. I guess I shouldn't have said only. And NIE must be signed, as I said, by the heads of all intelligence agencies, which suggests there's a common understanding of these arguments. So we're just thinking about inductive arguments, the mosts and the likelies. Suggests that these different agency heads and groups and analysts involved in them all mean the same thing by most, or likely, or plausible, stuff like that. Here's some quotes. We assess that Baghdad has begun renewed production of mustard sarin, cyclosarin, and VX. Its capability probably is more limited now than it was at the time of the Gulf War. Iraq possesses ballistic missiles with a likely range. Likely, possibly, probably comes up throughout the document. What does that mean? I don't know. Pick one. These are all standards that are used across various agencies. This is a known problem. I'm not like, this isn't like a gotcha smoking gun moment. Like everybody knows this is an issue. We use what Kesselman calls estimative words in various ways, and it's important to get some kind of standardization around them. And this is what people have done in various groups. They've tried to create some associated probability or numerical quantity or something, just some characterization that everybody can get on the same page about. The problem is that many groups use different standards. As we'll see, we're ontologists, right? Talk about siloing all the time. This is going to come up again as we progress through the course. I'll talk specifically about these slides, or this slide again, in the context of those silos. But just here, again, all these analysts have to come together and agree on something. It's plausible, something of this magnitude. They should be using the same words the same way. There are notoriously problematic weasel words or words of estimation. It's not clear that is always the case. Again, does that make sense? No. Throughout, it is just to say it's unlikely. Unlikely they were used, pun intended. I almost put pun intended in parentheses, but Barry told me I was too funny and I needed to stop. Okay, induction aside, there's this other form of argument that's worth discussing, abduction. It's basically arguments to the best explanation. While there are often multiple potential explanations for a given event, some are better than others. A black and white cat that answers to Otis begs me for treats at a certain time.
She would never.
That I know, that an identical cat, it seems to be, answers to Otis begs me for treats at a later time. The best explanation is that it's the same cat, my cat Otis, that Matthew has a lot of experience with.
And she never begs.
She never begs for treats. She's always begging for treats. This is a plausible explanation. It's not like there's a worse explanation that are two different cats and they happen to look alike and they both beg for treats and they both answer to Otis. It's a worse explanation, but you see. Best explanation. The more a plausible example for what we're discussing. There are multiple signals of troop movement near a contested border. Fact. Each of the following explain this. Routine military exercises, preparation for an invasion, defensive training mission. They could all explain one. In addition, there has been increased political tension in the area. In addition, previous intelligence indicates potential military escalation. The best explanation given 1 and 3 and 4 is preparation for an invasion. Now it could be, the other cases could be true as well, like they could be true. But it looks like the evidence that you're gathering suggests one of these hypotheses is a better explanation than the others. Still a risky conclusion. It's still not guaranteed. So we talk about like going down rabbit holes, right? As I was mentioning, sometimes exploring the rabbit holes, especially in these high stakes circumstances where you're trying to find somebody who's been kidnapped or maybe a child or something that's been missing, follow down whatever leads you can. And some of these explanations start to seem better than others. And this is how you get there, abductive reasoning, a best explanation based on the given evidence that you have at a time. Not a conclusion that outstrips the premises, or not a conclusion about the likelihood or the probability or something like that. More or less an explanation that's supposed to tie all this together in the best way. Does that make sense?
Could an abductive argument also be inductive if it has the same amount of risk or uncertainty involved? Like the best explanation could be you know, equally as uncertain as the orange example. Is there
Sure.
crossover there?
If you were to change this conclusion to something like, if all this is true, or maybe put another premise as if all this is true, then H2 is the best explanation. And you say something like H2 is the most likely explanation. And you could change it into an inductive argument. And there's like induction going on through abduction. But here we're like highlighting the conclusion proper. There are different ways to conclude. An example of this from science. I don't know, have you guys heard of this Einstein guy? Is that his name? Einstein? I always have a hard time pronouncing his name. Einstein. Anyway, I don't know if you're familiar with the history of like physics, but he looked around and there was all this conflicting data about like light and gravity and mass. There was a bunch of like actually legitimately conflicting experimental data. And he was like, I'm a patent clerk with nothing else to do. I will think about how to unify all this data by reframing some assumptions that we make about the field. And that's what he did. It was theoretical. He started talking about light and its speed. He started talking about the relationship between gravity and mass. It turns out he put forth a theory that it's connected, made it like got rid of all of the inconsistencies for the most part, and kind of created a unified picture of the data that folks were or like developing or creating, or I guess obtaining. Best explanation for the data was that general and special relativity were true. In fact, he went on record when they finally did some experiments about like general relativity, later special relativity. They like somebody had, I don't know, they like did an expedition to Antarctica or something because they had to get like outside. I don't know. Anyway, as the expedition was going on, somebody said, hey, what if they find counter evidence to your theory? He, implicit in his statement was that it did such an elegant job explaining everything. He said, well, if they do, then God was wrong because the theory's right. Because it explained everything. Argument of the best explanation. That's how it got there. Does that make sense? Conclusion not guaranteed to follow. Happens all the time. Putative best explanations for conclusions drawn in the NIE justifying the war with Iraq were contrasted in that same document with alternative explanations. This is what I've been referring to here and there. So this is the first key judgment in the document if you look at it. It's unclassified, by the way. We judge that Iraq has continued its weapons of mass destruction programs in defiance of UN resolutions and restrictions. Baghdad has chemical and biological weapons as well as missiles with ranges in excess of UN restrictions. If left unchecked, it probably will have a nuclear weapon during this decade. CINR, alternative view at the end of the key judgments. You go down, and this is where that starts. The Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, INR, believes that Saddam continues to want nuclear weapons and that available evidence indicates that Baghdad is pursuing at least a limited effort to maintain and acquire nuclear weapon-related capabilities. The activities we have detected do not, however, add up to a compelling case that Iraq is currently pursuing what INR would consider to be an integrated and comprehensive approach, blah, 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 beginning of the sentence. Alternative explanation. If you actually go on and like the continuation of that paragraph, they provide alternative explanations for why certain manufacturing has been conducted. They go through by like accepting some of the expert testimony, but then drawing a different conclusion about what these certain things that are being manufactured for that has nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction. So let me sum up. Flow through the context of the NIE used to justify the war in Iraq, challenges and uses of intelligence in high-stakes circumstances. We leveraged resources from contemporary epistemology to add structure to that investigation and ultimately close by outlining forms of risky argument that are often offered in the context of intelligence analysis. And we're also, I'll add, benefited by some subject matter expertise on the call. Jack, thank you. By helping flesh out the picture of the challenges that intelligence analysts encounter. Now, I'm gonna pause here. Questions, comments? Yes.
I know we want to eventually define intelligence. My very first question is, do we have to figure out what best means in inference to the best explanation? Or is that on the domain end of things?
I don't know, but I wouldn't go too tied up. I often say best candidate explanation. And I usually will allow for multiple candidate explanations that count. So I think of it as a set of explanations. And that is the best set. The things in it are all the best. They do an equal job of explaining. I mean, I can't decide which one. Here's an alternative explanation to the theories of electromagnetism. They have positive and negative charges, right? Positive, whatever. Flip the positive and negatives. Everything's the same. Different theory. Explains all the same stuff, has all the same virtues, both best candidates. That's a silly example, but I will I'm only pointing this out because I don't want you to get tripped up on best. Now, to your question though, it is like filling in what counts as an element to that set. Yeah, that's a domain question. Like I'm not an analyst. I don't know.
Tim has his hand up.
Yeah, Tim.
Hey, so I would challenge the example here
Okay.
because I think I mean, it makes sense the way you've laid it out, but my argument, I guess, would be that the conclusion was already derived at by the policymakers, and intelligence community was told to back into it, right? And usually it's the other way around. Policy decision and policymakers make decisions about how to move out in a particular path of policy based on inputs from all sorts of people, including the IC. And this example is the exact opposite. The decision to invade or the decision to lash back was already made, and then we had to justify it. So it's sort of like the reverse method that is normally adhered to. And I've got to drop at noon, so just
No, I think that's
why.
right. I appreciate that. I think that's right. So in any characterization I've seen about this set case from like directors or whatever who are like retrospecting, that's essentially what they say as well. They say there was so much pressure. It's almost like the policy had been made already, and we were just trying to find a way to go forth with it and then provide the justification we needed to warrant this. And then there was still, even with that resistance, the analysts were still doing, what they should do and being cautious and investigating as they could. But they gave just enough ammo to let Powell go in front of the UN and let, all the marketing and whatnot to create a coalition of the willing, to give them that ammo they needed to like generate enough interest so they could move out without like violating UN policy or whatnot. But I think Tim is actually absolutely correct here. Like
I've got to drop, but I wanted to ask you something, John.
Yeah.
So Bayesian algorithms are really hard when you don't have a good, so you showed all the charts, and that's a known problem that we don't know what to say is good, bad, or ugly, or all different categories and different agencies, and even in the military, they have different ones in different parts of the military. So, but when you're talking about the subjective argument, are you really looking at like an ontology to build a pattern of life that's a universal, and then you can apply it to the instance? And then if you get enough of that, because that's what a Bayesian algorithm does, it says, okay, there's like 9 factors that mean there's going to be a riot. If at least 6 of these happen, we think the probability is at 90%. Is that what we're going to try to do from an ontological perspective with universal models?
So so part of this is yes, part of this is no. So I think that currently the state of the representation that feeds into these algorithms, like this already, there's data analysis that goes on without us, but the representations are not good enough to give us like real justification of the sort that is warranted in scenarios like this. And so what I've done in the past, working in a previous employer, is build enough of the ontology representation, just enough I can hand off to folks who do the analytics and feed into their algorithms and trust what is being fed in at a universal level, provides like guidance for the instance level as well. So there's a lot of stuff that is, either built in to these algorithms on the fly because it's not coming in at a universal level because folks aren't, Bayesian calculators aren't thinking about these sorts of things, which if they did could get rid of a little or some of the like get rid of gaps in their knowledge, add background information. They basically change the calculations because they have more info to pull from. And that is sort of what we can bring in terms of value to these sorts of analyses. Does that make sense? Did he already drop?
Yeah, he's gonna come back. We had a 12, now it's 12:30.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
Gotcha. No worries. But Tim, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm telling him to come back. He'll be back in a minute.
Okay. Yeah. No worries. No worries. Mike, you've got your hand up. We can give it.
Yeah, so, sometimes there's like universal, I guess, something that is a sort of like a fact, right? So in this case, for nuclear weapons at this time, if someone has fissile material, right? You can make a weapon within months, a fission bomb, something Hiroshima, Nagasaki, what North Korea has, right? Not the weapons that we have. Those are a little bit more difficult. So I'll put it in the chat. This is a document. So, in the, right, let's see. So one of the justifications for invading is that, an independent source of information says that, Saddam Hussein could build a nuclear bomb within months, right? If he had fissile material, right? And just the idea that, that's a universal, I don't know, a truth. Any one of us in this room, if we had the fissile material, could build a weapon within months. It's not that difficult to do. So when you have something that's I guess another example would be, someone could shoot someone if they had a gun. Right?
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, anyone could kill somebody if they had a gun. Well, does that person have a gun?
Right. Are they trying to get one? Are there, and I think relevant here, are they behaving in such a way that makes it seem like they might be trying to? I think there was evidence that in this case, Saddam Hussein was behaving in a way. I mean, even the dissenting opinion was like, it does seem like he is behaving in such a way to obtain this sort of stuff. And that's worrisome, like understandably worrisome. Now, doesn't mean he's going to do it. No, just like it doesn't mean if you have a gun, you're going to shoot somebody, right? Even if you have a track record of like being kind of aggressive when you drink or something like that. I don't know. But the mere fact of that is itself something that went into the analysis, right? As well it should, because it makes sense. Now, whether it justifies, war, an invasion like that is something the agencies disagreed on to some extent. But again, this is all complicated by Tim's point too, that a lot of this was policy decision already being made and like feeding into it and just giving enough ammunition to make the point. And I think it's plausible to me reading a document that here are reasons to think he might be conducting R&D in the future, or here's the reasons to think that he might be pursuing like bombs of this sort or creating bombs of this sort. He could do it in a few months if he had this material. I mean, that's enough ammunition, right? Like he's lied about not pursuing these things before. It all makes sense, right? Like that's the point. It all makes sense. You can tell a plausible story to justify it. Is that your
Sure.
point, Mike? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, there's also an old movie or something like that. It's about Canada invading the United States, right? And in one of it's called Canadian Bacon, if anybody's interested.
Oh my gosh. Is that what that
watching
movie
it.
is about? I've never seen that.
Yeah, and so yeah, there's but the idea is that in one of the news stories, it's like, the population of Canada is amassed along the northern border of the United States, right? As a justification as an impending invasion is going to happen. Well, no, the population just happens to be there.
Right. Yeah.
Even though it's solid intelligence, right?
Exactly. I love it. Very good. Jay, yes?
No, I cut off and you, I guess, you asked a question to me and I wanted to let you know I was.
Yeah, I was just asking if what I had said about what you had pointed out made sense. But
I think so. Then I left the meeting, so I didn't hear the last part of it, but we don't have to go back to that. But I think so. I mean, yeah.
let me then run folks here through an exercise. That's the last thing I'd like to do today. Here's what I'd like you to think about. And feel free to talk to one another in small groups about what I'm going to ask you. And those of you online, feel free to chat away. Or if you prefer, I can put you in like a little breakout room and you can talk about this. Maybe that'll be a thing to do. But here's what I want you to think about. You got an individual who is like taking in information from, vetted and unvetted sources like Twitter and then some vetted documents, something like this. So trying to like compile this information together. Because they're trying to like draw some conclusions out of it. I don't know, out of like, I don't know, like, construction going on in Algeria. I don't know, make up your own case. They're just trying to find intelligence about something going on in another country. The content of it is not as important as what I'd like you to think about, which is, tell me specifically, if you can, what a model of that domain, that characterization I just described, what a model of that looks like. That involves things like a person, monitors, beliefs, things believed, behaviors associated with beliefs. I want you to take this challenge and spell out in as minute detail as you can all the aspects of what goes into a very somewhat simple case, like somebody taking in source information from different sources and trying to draw conclusions about it. Tell me specifically what that model looks like. Spoiler, it may involve arguments and defeaters. It may involve the various things that we've been talking about. It may involve a lot of other things too. Would you like for me to put you in a small group where you can talk? Just curious what you got.
We picked an example that's really weird, I think. I don't know.
Okay. So John, what we need is a gut check to see if we're heading in the right direction. The key question was, is my councilman going to support a new stop sign on my street? Right?
Yeah.
And so we were going to identify key players, organizations, and people, channels of information, news, neighborhood newsletter. Arguments for it were like protect the children, and then defectors or whatever it was is like, is it useful if it's coming off a highway? If it's a heavily traveled route, will it impact economic factors like Jay's General Store? Have we explored traffic circles? But we weren't sure if that's what you were looking for.
I love it. I love it. Can you say that one more time? I want you to say it for the rest of the group.
Sure.
Then I'll embellish and add to this. So hey, just a second. So if I can have your attention for a moment, Tim is going to explain what the group online is modeling. Tim, floor is yours.
Sure. So we tried to come up with like a key question that we were trying to answer, and our key question was, is my councilman going to support a new stop sign on my street? We, sought to identify key players, organizations, and people, channels of information distribution, via the news, neighborhood newsletter, etc. Arguments for it were to protect the children, figure out whether or not there were already requirements to have a stop sign at the end of the street. And some of the deflectors were, is it useful if it comes off a highway? If it's a heavily trafficked route, will it impact, economic concerns? What about traffic circles rather than stop signs, etc.?
Very good. Very good. The way we do it in the Buffalo school is we have as you'll learn this, by the way, but I just want to highlight here, we have a rather weak theory that sits on top of all sorts of extensions of the theory, and it's weak on purpose so that it can serve as that foundation. Now, we model the world in many different ways. We don't always know which model is going to be useful. Computers aren't always going to know which model is going to be useful. All of this information is valid. It's all good to have. It's good for prediction. It's good for modeling specific use cases, specific competency questions. It's also potentially useful for answering questions we don't know we want to answer yet. Barry likes to sometimes say, we probably have a cure for cancer in the data, or cure for cancers in the data, we just haven't connected it. I like to say we probably have answers to, or what research questions we should be asking about how to be immortal, but we haven't connected all the data yet. Part of why I'm doing this is so that I can live forever. Now, that aside, you see the idea, part of this challenge, part of the goal in our community is this sort of like prediction or identification of hypotheses that we didn't even know to ask. New cases, novelty, creativity. So I want to highlight that because all of this is valuable information, either for a specific use case that I asked you to model, or ones that I haven't asked you to model that I didn't even think to ask you to model. And now I want to get to a place, and ultimately we hope to get to a place where I don't have to think about asking you these questions. We can leverage computers to come up with the questions that we didn't think about asking. And we need to get there first by modeling a lot. Does that make sense?
John,
Yes.
if you went back to Einstein, right, and you built a physics ontology, and you had all known knowns from the time that Einstein wrote his general relativity of, general relativity, and you basically, had universals for all relationships between everything that was known inside of physics, and you also had all of the theorems and the equations that were known to be solid, and you put that into an ontology, and then you put that into some type of knowledge graph or LLM, or start asking Sparkle queries. Do you think that it would generate E equals MC squared?
I don't.
Would notice that those three things have these things in common,
Yeah,
or they're an element of the human mind that we just can't emulate?
Yeah, I think so. I like a lot of this question because I think so I think the answer, the straight answer is not obviously yes, but that's not my goal. My goal would not be to generate automatically E equals MC squared. My goal would be more akin to what I was trained to do as a mathematician. So my training is in math, and one of the first things they teach you in math is if you have a challenging problem you can't make progress on, translate it into another language and see what changes and what stays the same. And you do that over and over again. It's a reframing of the problem so that you can see what's important and what's not. Now, that is very hard to do manually. Mathematicians do this all the time, but it takes years and decades of practice. I want a computer to do that for me. So,
and then you also have the Blue Sky Initiative, and that was canceled in the 1970s, which, going back to World War II after Oppenheimer, the government, even before then, the government was like, hey, you're super smart. We're just going to throw money at you,
right,
and stuff. And then some politician out in Wyoming was like, why are we spending all this money on these theoretical physicists? But before then, they had kind of cowboy mathematics that they would just sort of take leaps, but they were allowed to because they weren't really going to lose funding, and now they don't. How do you, but the thing is, for them taking leaps, it would take months and months and months of them going to a chalkboard. But you could have a quantum computer do everything that they did in months and months and months in a period of minutes. You then build in the cowboy mathematician.
I'm not sure of that part, but like, to me, what I want to get to, what I'm aiming for is getting to a place where where like the computers can build in, we have enough information that can output hypotheses or plausible hypotheses that we can evaluate as creative humans. And this is like, there are two reasons I'm thinking of this is the future. One is I had a linear algebra professor who once said, hey, everybody in this room, this first day of class, how many of you can calculate large numbers in your head? And like half the class raised their hand. And he was like, don't do that. Computers are better at it. Don't be an idiot. Do something computers can't do. That's what I'm always aiming for. And that's one piece, always trying to do what computers can't do. And I think that little piece of creativity you're talking about might be something computers can't do, but we need to build up the representation and the machinery around it so we can get to a place where we can take advantage of what they can do so we can be even more creative. The other is, I learned this lesson about Leonard Hinkin, who's this famous logician back in the day. And if you know anything about logic, he's in textbooks all over the place for this theorem he proved that he came upon by accident. He was trying to do something else, and he's known throughout history for this theorem. It's called Hinkin's theorem, but he wasn't even trying to do it. he did something, he was trying to do something else, and then he realized how valuable his mistake was. That's, to me,
That's
that's creativity, right? And I
Yeah.
want to get to a place where like his expertise and knowledge of logic allowed him to see the value in his mistake. I want to automate as much of that as possible so that everybody, to the extent we can see the values in the mistakes, and we can make better progress.
Pharmaceutical companies have made the most money off their mistakes and thinking that something was going to cure something, and then it fixed nicotine addiction or grew hair.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. I think this is great.